Hello everyone, welcome to Big Data Thoughts. Today we are going to talk about a very important concept called virtualization, and we would also look at virtual machines. What are they? How are they created? What are the core concepts of virtualization and how is it beneficial? So let's get started. First of all, let's start with what is virtualization. So as the name suggests, it talks about something which is virtual. So if we talk about virtualization in one line or one definition, it will be virtualization is the process of running a virtual instance of a computer system in a layer abstracted from actual hardware, which means there is one machine which is a physical machine with hardware, like it has some CPU, it has RAM, it has disk. It's one single machine, but we are using virtualization to create multiple instances of that machine, which are known as virtual machines, or they are virtual instances. So in reality, there is one physical server, but we are creating multiple copies and instances using a virtualization software, which are those instances are called VMs. Now, how this is useful or how this is created, we will see that. So first of all, let's understand whatever I spoke just now about virtual instances. What does it exactly mean? So if there is a physical machine, it will have the first layer as the hardware, which is nothing but our CPU, memory, disk, all of that. That hardware is controlled by a operating system. Operating system is a interface or a layer between my applications and the hardware. So it's a middleman which is talking to the hardware. Now let's assume for a second that there is a physical system with hardware and it has a Windows operating system. Now what will happen is on this Windows operating system, then we will install different applications. So Windows operating system or any operating system will act between the application and the hardware. That is how typically a physical machine would look like. Now, when we talk about virtualization, we want to have multiple VMs created on top of this physical machine. How would that happen? So we would have hardware, we would again have some operating system, let's say Windows operating system. But between the Windows operating system and our applications, there will be a virtualization layer. Now how that will help is, if you see here, there is a physical machine which has Windows operating system, but since I have a virtualization layer in between, I can actually have another operating system on top of this Windows system. And essentially, I can have multiple virtual machines. They may be Linux, they may be Mac OS, they may be Windows, any of them on top of this Windows operating system machine, because I have a virtualization software installed, which will help me to create multiple instances, and they can have their own version of OS. So that is how a virtualization would look like. You would have a virtualization software. Typically, this virtualization layer would have something called hypervisor, which enables us to create multiple VMs on top of this physical hardware or this physical machine. So we will look at what is hypervisor, but this is how a virtualization looks like. Now when I talk about virtualization, what are we generating or getting out of having a virtualization software or virtualizing the physical machine? We are getting multiple instances of virtual machines, which is nothing but VM. So a VM is a virtual computer or a software defined computer within the physical server. And it is nothing but a code, a piece of code. So you would have a server with its own OS. You would have a virtualization layer in between, a virtualization software, where I mentioned that the main component there is a hypervisor, which will then enable you to create multiple VMs. So this is the VM layer, where the VM is like a self-contained environment, a virtual self-contained environment where you have its own OS, it has its own bin and libraries, it has all the applications that you want to package in that VM. So this virtualization software or the hypervisor is helping to create multiple VMs on a physical server. And why would I do that is, what are the characteristics of VMs? So one, there is a physical machine and we can have multiple VMs. So it is a many-to-one relationship or one-to-many relationship. These VMs are completely isolated. So on a Windows operating system machine, I can have 3 VMs. Each of them can have Linux OS, it can have Windows OS and Mac OS. So there is no restriction to that, since we are virtualizing the environment or creating VMs. That's the flexibility it provides. Despite having the host OS as Windows, I can have other OS flavors installed on the same machine. Now these VMs are all sharing the same hardware of the host machine. Earlier days when we did not have virtualization, if there were high-end servers or machines, even in normal machines, all of the capacity or all of the hardware was not getting utilized all the time. So having VMs, multiple VMs getting created on that physical server will help to utilize the hardware also better. And these VMs are completely isolated from each other. So if there is any issue in one of the VMs, it does not affect the others. It does not affect the host also. So that's the benefit of having VMs. Scalability is more, it's flexible. You can actually have multiple VMs and utilize the software better. Now, what are the benefits or what are the scenarios in which we are using VMs? So one is when we want to build and deploy apps to the cloud. So any cloud provider, whether it is Amazon, Google or Microsoft Azure, all of them are heavily relying on VMs. So they have their physical setup, but they are spawning up different virtual machines that are getting assigned to users. When we provision or when we ask for infrastructure from the cloud providers, we are actually getting virtual machines, and virtual machines are the one we are interacting with. We are not really working with the physical hardware. The physical hardware is there in the backend, but we are interacting with the VMs. It is very, very essential in terms of building and deploying apps on cloud. When we want to try out new operating system like beta releases, this VM can really help us. If we want to spin up newer environments, it is very easy to run dev test scenarios. We can back up our existing OS. And now the benefit is, even if I have a Windows machine today, I want to experiment something on Linux or Mac OS. Do I have to buy a new machine now? No. I can have a virtualization software installed. The hypervisor in that virtualization software will create multiple VMs for me, and on the same machine that I had earlier, the Windows machine, I can have a Linux VM setup, a Mac OS VM setup. That way I can do my testing. I don't have to invest in additional hardware. So this really helps me in cost saving also. Now if there is some virus infected data or an old application, which is on an old application, we can actually have a VM and install an older OS on that and then assess. Because it's a self-contained environment, even if it is virus infected data, it will not affect the other VMs. I can run softwares and apps on operating system that weren't originally intended for. Meaning, I built a software for Windows, but I want to do a cross platform testing where I want to test it on or a cross OS testing rather. I want to test it on other OS as well. I can easily do it by using a virtualized environment. So all in all, these are the benefits of using a VM. Now, since we spoke about hypervisor as someone who is helping us to do this VM initiation and creation of virtualized environments, let us look a bit on the hypervisor side. What does it mean and how is it creating those? So what are hypervisors? We spoke about virtualization, we spoke about virtual machines. So who is that who is helping us to create those virtual machines on a physical machine? So that component is nothing but hypervisor. It is part of our virtualization softwares. What is the function of hypervisor? Simply put, it is helping us to have multiple virtual computers on a single physical computer. That job is done by a hypervisor. Now, what does a hypervisor do? Let's look at this. First of all, you will have one physical machine, which is like a host hardware that will have some hardware. It will have its own operating system. But I want to create, let's say this was Windows. I want to create 3 more operating system environments. Windows, Linux and Mac OS. What would I do? I would install a virtualization software which will have hypervisor. That hypervisor will enable 3 VMs for me with different OSs. And all of these VMs are actually having their own virtual CPU, RAM and storage. So the host operating system, the host hardware has CPU, RAM, storage. But since I have installed a virtualization software, the hypervisor is creating 3 VMs for me which is utilizing this hardware but having its own virtual CPU, RAM and storage. And each VM is self-contained with its own CPU, RAM and storage. So this is what a hypervisor will do. Now when we talk about hypervisors, there are actually two types of hypervisors which are predominantly used in the market, and I want to touch upon them also in short. So the first type of hypervisor is type 1, which is, or rather I would say type 1 hypervisor means the function is the same. It is creating VMs on a physical machine, but here if you see, hypervisor sits between the hardware and the operating system. So if you have a Windows machine, the hypervisor is sitting between your Windows operating system and hardware. It will help you to create a VM with Linux operating system, right? It is doing the same function, but the placement of the hypervisor is little different. What we saw earlier was the hypervisor was sitting between the host operating system and the VMs, but here it is closer to the hardware. It is sitting between the host operating system and the hardware. So this is known as a type 1 hypervisor and also known as bare metal. Why? Because it is closer to the hardware, the metal, the hardware. That's why it is known as bare metal hypervisor. And it's very commonly used by all cloud providers to provision their high-end servers into multiple VMs. So whether it is Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all of them are using type 1 kind of hypervisor to give us the VMs that we are requesting. Typically, the softwares, virtualization software that are used are Microsoft, or the hypervisor are VMware ESXi and Microsoft Hyper-V. These are bare metal hypervisors. And type 2 hypervisor is what we saw in the previous slides. The hardware is there, the host operating system and the VM. This is the VM operating system. Between them is the hypervisor. It's just the placement of the hypervisor which segregates the hypervisor into type 1 and type 2. Now, if we look at the type 1 hypervisor, because it is widely used by the cloud providers, I would like to talk a bit more about this one. So, who is using it? All the prominent cloud vendors are using it just to provide us with the VMs. Why it is good, the type 1 hypervisor? Because it does a very effective use of hardware. It abstracts the entire OS from the hardware because it is sitting in between. So earlier, where there was a direct or tight coupling between the hardware and OS, the host OS and the host hardware were tightly coupled and the hypervisor was sitting like on top. Here it is not like that. Here the hypervisor is sitting closer to the hardware, and then you have the host OS and the VM OS. So it is abstracting the OS from the hardware. It is doing a loose coupling between them, and it is using the hardware more effectively. This is known as the bare metal hypervisor. Now coming on to the benefits of overall, what are the benefits of virtualization? We have looked at conceptually what it is, VMs, hypervisors and all of that, but if you have to sum it up and say what are the benefits of using virtualization as a concept, one, ease of use, because on one single machine you can spin up multiple VMs. And a virtualization software hypervisor would do it for you. So it's ease of use, it's flexibility. You can do a lot of experimentation with different flavors of OSs. You can do application cross OS testing because you can host multiple OSs on one single machine, and it is also cost efficient. So all in all, these are the benefits of virtualization. I hope this video would help you to get started on the journey of virtualization. So thank you so much for watching. Please share, subscribe and like the channel to get more interesting videos. Thank you.